Well, good morning. If we've not met and you're visiting with us today, or you've just forgotten because it's been a while, my name's DJ. It's so nice to have you in our midst this morning. As Joel welcomed you this morning, thank you for making the decision to be here. We're honoured that you have made that decision, whether you're new or whether you're a long-time new viner. It's wonderful to have you here. Joel and Libby, in her beautiful prayer, also mentioned the Olympics. I've got to confess, I do love the Olympics. And there's so many stories of, just wonderful stories of humanity, isn't there, that unfold in it. My family, we particularly love the Paralympics. Anybody else really like watching the Paralympics? Yeah, we like it for reasons that probably become evident shortly, but again, so many stories of overcoming adversity, of commitment, overcoming the challenges, of injury, of life, of getting up in the dark every morning, day after day, or being out on the road, running or riding or something for hours on end. To all the athletes amongst us, I salute you because I threw out my back just watching the Olympics.
4 wins yesterday, Newvine.
There we go, 4 wins to the Newvine football teams. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks for the reminder. Yeah. Thanks, Joel. I wasn't kidding about throwing out my back, actually, so I can... That's why. Anyway, it's kind of topical this morning. But I'm going to start with a trigger warning this morning. Not for you, for me. If you've known me a little bit, you'll know that being open and personally transparent and vulnerable in public is not something that comes easily or naturally to me. It's something I'm getting better at as a pastor who stands up here often, but I'm having to learn how to do that and do it appropriately.
Hanky ready.
I did ask my wife just before I came up if she had any tissues here. So being kind of personal in front of people doesn't come naturally to me. I'm kind of a by the book, stick to the script kind of guy, as you probably know if you've seen me in action before. But this morning, I can't avoid getting personal because this topic is personal for me and for us as a family. It's a message, actually, that I haven't been ready to preach for the last 15 years. And even as I've prepared this week, I've been startled and somewhat alarmed to find out how unprepared I still am, even at this point in time. There's still, I think, I've discovered some unprocessed emotions for me in all of this. So apologies in advance if I have to pull out that packet of tissues at some stage. And maybe that's why I am not usually comfortable being so kind of personal up front. But, ready or not, the time has come. Because even though this sermon may be too personal for me to preach, it's too important not to. And to be clear, that while the message is personal for me and for us as a family, it's not about me and it's not about us as a family. I am going to share a little bit of our journey, our story, not to put a spotlight on us as a family and our experiences. I do so to put a spotlight on the question, how can Newvine become uncommonly inclusive? But beyond that, how can Newvine offer uncommon love to 2 groups of people in our midst who remain among the most socially isolated groups? People living with disability and people living with mental illness. And even though I want to talk about both groups, I'm not trying to say they're the same thing. They are different things, but I think there is some similarity about the experience that many people in either of or both of those groups can have. Not everyone, but some. In fact, perhaps way too many. Experiences that have some similarities when it comes to social experiences. One more thing to say is that our story is one of journeying with disability, not so much with mental illness. So I'll probably lean more towards that side of things just because that's our own experience But I do understand that some of the same things can be resonant or true for those who live with mental illness. Today I want to talk about disability as inclusive of things like neurodiverse conditions, like autism spectrum disorder, other neurodiverse ways of living in the world, cognitive impairments, which is part of our family's experience, but also things like physical impairments, etc. And then, of course, in the mental illness, that's a range of things in it. Some of you are far more expert in that than I am, but it can include things from social anxieties through to psychoses and so on. And I think the fact that many people who live with these realities experience socialisation is true both in our broader society, but also here in church, and dare I say here even perhaps in our own church. So the challenge for us is that if Kerry Newhoff is right when he says no one should be able to out-community the church, then how do we as a church become an uncommon community known for love for people who find it often the most difficult to experience genuine community? Because as the Australian Bureau of Statistics data released last month tells us, 5.5 billion Australians have a disability, including our daughter Bethany. That's 21.5% of the Australian population. That means that 1 in 5 of us here, if we are anything like representative of the broader community, live with some kind of cognitive, neurological or physical impairment. And 8% of the total population in Australia live with a profound or severe or significant impairment. Similarly, a study released earlier this year showed that 22%, so almost the same number, although they're not necessarily the same group, there is undoubtedly some overlap, but 22% of Australians aged 16 to 85 experienced a mental disorder in the last 12 months. Again, that's over 1 in 5 of us and of those around us. Those that we hope will join us, those that we long to reach out to in our community. And even if you're among if you're among the 4 out of 5 of one of those groups, the rest, if you like, outside of that 1 in 5 in both areas. Well, here's the bad news. Chances are, at some stage in your life, you'll become one of the 1 in 5. Live long enough, and you'll very likely experience a disability, a physical, cognitive, or neurological impairment, or at least significant chronic disease, which can have, if you like, a disabling effect. I kind of think I've lived long enough already to to experience that in a minor way. The data tell us that 15% of people aged 0 to 64 years live with a disability. So 15% of our pre-retirees, if you like. But over 52% of people aged 65 and over live with a disability, while 86 or 87% nearly live with one or more long-term health conditions. And if you live to 75, the likelihood increases significantly. In fact, many disability scholars have pointed out that rather than regarding disability and able-bodiedness as permanent categories, we should regard people not currently living with a disability as tabs, temporarily able-bodied. But many of us, perhaps including you or someone you love, is already there. Either you experience life with a disability or mental illness, or you have a partner, a family member, a close friend who does. Well, that's certainly true, as I've said, for us as a family, so I don't talk about this in public much. But today I want to share a little of our story of being a special needs family and relate that to what it means for us as a church. And my lovely wife, Louise, is on standby to tell a story if I can't. She may have to preach the rest of the sermon. So thanks, Lou. Lou has told the story a lot more than I have, and I'm realising I probably should have told it more. Our oldest daughter, Bethany, for those of you who don't know her, she's now 17. She was born with what we now know to be an ultra-rare cask gene mutation. When I say ultra-rare, I mean that in a population of just over 8 billion people on the planet, there are 300 known cases of her condition globally. Though, of course, there are probably more that are undiagnosed. But when Beth was born, we had no idea. In her early months, Beth did what all newborns do. What's more, she had great taste in footy teams, just saying. She was a smiley, happy, easygoing infant. And it was only as she began to miss one milestone after another that it began to become clear that she was not meeting development markers. The details of that journey are for another time, but suffice to say that Beth turned 2 amid a whirlwind of tests and specialists and therapists, and some of you know this kind of journey all too well. An MRI finally gave us answers, even if just descriptively. Beth had cerebellar hyperplasia. In short, Beth's cerebellum hadn't grown, and almost all of its functions were having to be outsourced to other parts of the brain. Now, neuroplasticity, the capacity of the brain to adapt to damage and deficits in its architecture, is a remarkable thing. But it turns out your cerebellum is pretty important. And other parts of Beth's brain, while making a stellar attempt, are not able to entirely compensate. So by 2.5, Beth had a diagnosis, but no prognosis. There were so few cases known, particularly in Australia, and that had been studied, that no one could really tell us what the future looked like, whether Beth would ever walk, I think I'm okay. The received wisdom for preachers is share your scars, even your scabs, but not your open wounds. Sorry, I'm sharing an open wound. So we didn't know if Beth would walk, talk, or even survive. But by God's grace, she did. All 3. Nevertheless, with significant cognitive and some physical impairments. Whew. Deep breath. I think it's the Olympics. It's been bringing up all this emotion. If you've been through something similar or watched others do so, then you'll know how disassembling that kind of experience can be. A sudden accident, life-changing injury, or an unexpected diagnosis. Especially with your kids. Because as parents, we have expectations, aspirations and dreams that we don't even know we have until they're shattered. And when you have that experience, you're suddenly confronted with the emotions that go with that, which can clearly linger for many years. Grief for the childhood and the life you'd imagined for your child. Graduations or weddings that you'll never attend. And perhaps harder still. Why am I going harder still? Hard enough. Whew. Sorry. It's the kind of mother's guilt or parental guilt that you can experience, especially when the cause is not immediately clear. Was it something you did or didn't do? And I liken this to a contemporary version of the disciples' question to Jesus when they saw the man who was blind and said, "Who was it that sinned, that this person was born blind?" And I think of it in slightly different terms, not so much as I think the disciples meant, what kind of spiritual sin did someone commit that spiritually cursed, this kid, Jesus was quick to say, it doesn't work that way. That's not how God works. That's not how life works. But the questions for Lou and I were like, particularly Lou, was it the glass of wine she had before we knew she was pregnant? Or the antibiotics she took before she knew she was pregnant? Or for me, it was I a silent carrier of a faulty gene? Was I the cause of Beth's condition? You grapple with those things. Now for us, we now know that it was none of those things. It was a spontaneous gene mutation, which we finally found out in 2019, thanks to advances in gene technology. That is a mutation of Beth's cask gene. It was entirely unpredictable in the genetic lottery of a new life. But at the time, those are some of the questions which can plague you, along with the uncertainty about the future. What does it hold? What will Beth's life look like? On top of those things, though, come a host of social challenges. When do you explain, and what do you say in social settings as to why your child acts and interacts differently? How do you emotionally navigate the mums groups as other proud mums rightly talk about and compare their kids' milestones? What to say in the supermarket or Bunnings, as it often was in our case, when your child has an uncontrollable meltdown because they're overstimulated or just don't have any other means of expressing their feelings? Would you mind muting me? Yeah, otherwise I was just going to sniffle for ages. For us, it was actually finally moving to Scotland that served for us as a circuit breaker in this journey. It was a pretty nice house we had there, actually, wasn't it? No, actually, this was more like our neighbourhood. That was our actual neighbourhood. Arriving in Scotland, we had baggage, but we had no history. No one to say, but she was a normal baby, wasn't she? So Beth could just be Beth. And we could find our new identity as we were in that moment as a special needs family. It was there, Louise would say, that she had adjusted to being a special needs mum. It was there, by the grace of God, I found in the Faculty of Divinity at Aberdeen University, scholars who love Jesus, who love the Bible, and who specialise in a new discipline called disability theology. And that helped me immensely to grapple with the experience of disability in ways that made sense to me as a theologian. And it was there also in Scotland that we found a community, and by community, I mean a church, that welcomed and accepted and included Beth just as she was, not as she wasn't. That church community, and since we returned to Australia, particularly this church community, have been places that are rare for us, and perhaps for many who walk a disability or mental illness journey. They've been places where we don't have to explain Beth. Places where, even though she doesn't act and interact like many other people act and interact, she's just accepted, welcomed, and in many important ways included. Thank you. But I have a challenge to put to us this morning. And it's not a challenge about Beth per se. It's not a challenge about us. We don't need sympathy or any of that. It's a challenge about what sort of community we want to be, that we choose to be, for anyone and everyone like Beth, who doesn't act or interact like most other people, or who live with some kind of disability or mental well-being challenges. And I guess the challenge is something like this. Will our church community become an uncommon community by being not just uncommonly inclusive, but uncommonly loving of people with disability, additional needs, mental illness. Because the two are not quite the same. But I'll come back to that a little later. Will we do so not only because of the prevalence of disability in our midst and in our society, or the prevalence of mental illness, but because Jesus models for us and challenges us to be an inclusive community in which people living with those things are welcomed to the table to feast, find friendship, and to flourish. Nancy Blanche is going to now come and read our passage for us today. And while Nancy is coming up, this passage, if you want to look it up yourself, it'll be on the screen though. It's found in the book of the Bible that we call Luke. Hi, Nancy. And Luke is a book named after the first century biographer who gives us this account of Jesus' life and teaching. And in this passage, Jesus, who lived in ancient Israel in the early first century, is at a meal hosted at the house of a local VIP, a member of the religious elite. Jesus often clashed with members of this group, and it seems like this invitation was issued as a way of sussing Jesus out, if not catching him out. It was a setting in which people were very conscious of social status and the strict social protocols of who you would be seen with, and particularly who you would eat with. Nancy, thank you.
This reading is from Luke 14, 12 to 23. You can follow along on your screens or in your own Bible. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbours. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the one who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I've just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I've just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you'd ordered has been done, but there is still room.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out to the roads and country lanes and compel them to come in, so that my house will be full.'"
Thank you, Nancy. That's brilliant. Right, onto more comfortable territory. It's a great passage, this one. It's full of things that we don't have time to explore this morning. Like the key point that Jesus wants to make to his host. Don't do things for which you'll be repaid. Instead, welcome and invite those who can't repay you, and your reward will be, as they say, in heaven, or perhaps more accurately, in the new creation. And then he goes on to tell this parable about another meal, a great banquet. And on the surface, it's a story about any old garden variety great banquet. But the subtext here is that Jesus is the host. sending out invitation to all those who expected that they would be at the messianic banquet when Israel is restored to glory and power. But in Jesus' story, characteristically, nothing goes to plan. The good guys turn out to be not so much the good guys. And the heroes are unexpected. Indeed, something quite shocking happens. Just a little bit of cultural background quickly. In Jesus' day, banquet hosts would send out 2 invitations. The first is for catering purposes, like an RSVP. Would you honour me with your presence, save the date, etc., etc. And the number of responses would help the host decide, do I kill the fatted goat? Do I kill the fatted sheep, the fatted calf, or half a herd? How much do I need to cater? Once the invitations are accepted, then the host caters accordingly. Now, it's a time before calendars and clocks, so the second message is sent out basically to say, the calf is cooked and the party started, so come on over. In such a cultural setting, where food was often scarce and a banquet a great expense and a great honour, if you were going to decline, then you did so at the first invitation. You make your excuses, oh, sorry, I'm away that day, or I'm washing my hair, or whatever it might be. But once you'd accepted the invitation, unless there was a serious emergency, you were more or less honour bound to accept. The host has catered for you. There's no fridge for the leftovers. To beg off with some paltry excuse not only comes at a cost to the host, but dishonours them for their invitation. So in Jesus' parable, when all the guests have RSVP'd and then bail right at the start of the party, Jesus' listeners would have known that the excuses are not only feeble, but they're an affront to the hospitality and honour of the host. In fact, it almost seems they're all begging off. It almost seems like some kind of conspiracy to disgrace the host. But with the table set, the spit roast ready, and all these VPs suddenly too busy washing their hair, the host throws the original guest list out and issues a new invitation. All those that never usually get invited anywhere. Those people socially overlooked because they're a bit of an embarrassment. Go to them, the host says. The point of the parable is lots of people who are invited, the affluent, the able, the cool kids in school, and the leaders of Israel in Jesus' day, aren't actually interested in entering God's kingdom community, even though they said they were. Too busy, too distracted, perhaps too important. On one level, the parable then is about Israel in Jesus' day rejecting him and his invitation to live under his kingship, to come to his banqueting table. And so it signals that Jesus will turn instead to outsiders. But on another level, and for our purposes this morning, something really wonderful is going on here. In Jesus' day, the crippled, the lame, and the blind was a way of describing what we today would use the category of those living with disability for. There's no Greek or, for that matter, Hebrew word which serves in the same category way as disability today. So you describe a few conditions which were meant to signal a broad range of related disabilities. But people who were crippled, lame, or in some sense lived with a disability had to resort often to begging or whatever extremely menial, degrading, even dehumanising work that they could manage to do to survive. Thankfully, we've come some way as a society since then, although parts of the world that continues to be the case. But in Jesus' day, physical or mental impairments typically excluded people from polite company. And while a self-respecting Jewish leader may have offered them some alms, they would never have offered them a place at their table. But in Jesus' kingdom, we see in this parable, such people are not only invited, they become the guests of honour. And of course, to dine together in Jesus' day, it's not an act of charity. It's an act of equality, of acceptance, of inclusion. It's bringing them to a place where relationships are built over a long and lingering lunch. A banquet didn't end in an hour and a half. A banquet would go on all day, all night. Maybe the next day if there was still food to be consumed. There's no fridge to store it away. It was a place where relationships are built, friendships formed, and where those who are invited receive both the physical and the social nourishment for flourishment. I don't know if that's a word, but it rhymed. So not a meager meal, not survival rations, but a feast to fill their bellies and to satisfy their social cravings for company, laughter, love. In Scripture, the feast is symbolic of generosity. This feast is a symbol of God's generosity. It's also a symbol of those who are welcome at God's big table. Not just the able, the affluent, and the important, but everybody. To invite the cripple, the lame, and the blind, which today some of those are problematic terms that we'd steer clear of, but these were the biblical ways of talking about it. To invite such people was to extend God's own divine invitation to feast and flourish. So what can we take from this as a church when it comes to building an uncommon community? How uncommon is it really today to be inclusive of those with disability or mental illness? Well, certainly we've come a long way, as I say. In some ways, we're perhaps better than at any point in human history at recognising the human rights of people who live with disability, of providing programs like the NDIS, and emphasising accessibility and inclusion. But even so, there's still work to do. According to 2022 research, about 54% of the people living with a disability in Australia, 54%, just over half, report that they feel valued and respected in their community. And you can do the sums on the flip side of that. And that experience itself varies widely, even in the data. Those with intellectual disability in our hypercognitive world, it drops to 33%. A third of people living with intellectual disability in Australia report feeling valued and respected. So there's work to be done broadly, outside our walls. But I wonder how we as a church would score in that regard. From personal experience, pretty good. And we are grateful. But let me put a really sharp point on this here. As good as accessibility and inclusion is it simply enough to not feel discriminated against, to have your human rights respected, to be able to access and be included in things that others take for granted, even to have support like the NDIS? Now, it's better than the alternative, for sure. But does that create genuine community in and of itself? Yesterday, while we were talking about this message, Louise told me about a post on a disability support forum for mums of special needs kids. And the mums were reflecting with some sadness that the only people who hang out with their kids are paid to do so. Teachers, support workers, and therapists. And those things, again, are great and leaps and bounds that we've made, even in my lifetime. But that experience rang true for us as well. And it reminded me of a story that my friend John Swinton, in this book, Becoming Friends of Time, Disability, Timefulness and Gentle Discipleship, a story that he tells from his research. It's the story of Lorraine, a woman with special needs that he encountered in the course of researching for a project. She lives with specifically intellectual impairment. And let me read you just a little bit of what he writes. Thanks for bearing with me while I read some of this. He says, "Herein lay the problem. Lorraine attended church. She participated in the worship and loved having tea with her friends after the service. It looked as though she was included within that congregation. And in one sense she was. The people there certainly did not reject her. But when I asked her how often she saw her church friends during the week, the situation began to look a little different. She never saw them. Within the boundaries of the Sunday morning religious service of worship, she seems to have found acceptance, inclusion, and a certain level of friendship. However, that acceptance and friendship stopped at the door of the chapel. Lorraine was included, but she did not belong. No one visited her, no one missed her, because I suspect no one really loved her. To date," he goes on to say, and I'm skipping bits, "to date, the driving need has been to ensure that people with disabilities can find a place of inclusion within church communities and more broadly in society where they can be treated fairly and equally. This is, of course, a most important conversation that's had some success in opening up spaces of inclusion for people with a variety of disabilities. There's no question that inclusion is important. The problem with the inclusion agenda, and this is the nub of it, is that there's no innate moral mechanism that might obligate or even encourage people to love those whom society considers to be different. What he's saying is, may be clear, but inclusion does not necessarily equal love. He said Lorraine's problem was she was included, but she did not belong, and she was not necessarily loved. He goes on to say a little bit later on, he says, it's the ability to love, not the ability to include or tolerate, that is a primary mark of discipleship for followers of Jesus. Therefore, Christian communities are called not simply to include people with disabilities. The vocation of the Christian community is to learn to love God, and in coming to love God, learn what it means to love and to receive love from all its members. Oh, I've done it again. Sorry, Joel. Well, they're challenging words to be sure, and I'm almost done. I've gone over time. To be sure, it's not everyone's experience living with disability, but nor is Lorraine alone, as perhaps too many of you here know. So what do we do if we want to become a community known for love in this challenging space? Well, to be honest, I don't have the answers. Today is more a statement of intent, raising the question than offering a fully formulated plan. But the question is this: are we willing to do the hard work of figuring it out? The hard work of making our community, yes, accessible, yes, inclusive, but the far, far harder work of becoming a community characterized by love for those who continue to live without genuine community. And if we're not, well then let's close the door, turn out the lights, and put up the for sale sign. But if we are, let's fling open the doors, put up the everybody welcome here sign, and let this place light up like a signal fire of Jesus' love. Or more precisely, let this place become a foretaste of the great banqueting table at which everybody is welcome, where all find food and friendship to nourish not only their bodies, but to satisfy their social hunger and thirst, as well as having their ultimate spiritual needs met by our Lord, Saviour, and God. Okay, although I don't have all the answers, here are some starting points for us as I finish. Here are some things that we are eyeballing, and we can start to eyeball together. While becoming a community of love can't end with accessibility, it certainly has to start there. And we have some work to do in this space. We have good physical accessibility on this level, but we have a whole upper level up there that is completely inaccessible to people with mobility issues. I don't know what to do about that. It's not easy to solve. It's not cheap to solve, but it is something we need to eyeball, and we will. Here are some simple ways, though, that we can all help to improve accessibility. We can keep the drop-off free and accessible parking zones free for those who really need them. If you have mobility issues, use them. If you don't, please don't park in the drop-off zone or the accessible parking things. Also, let's keep passageways free of obstacles. If you see something, just do something. Say something or do something, and let's work at this together. We can all do those simple things. Secondly, sensory rooms and spaces. Thankfully, New Vine's got some good history in some of these matters. If the worship team would like to come up, we'll sing very soon and close. We already have a quiet space, sensory room, in our New Vine kids spaces, the Heroes Room. We need to rethink that a little bit more, but we're also considering how we can create a quiet space down here for those who need a break from overstimulating environments. But changing our architecture is not enough. We also need to change our attitudes. So, awareness and sensitivity. I've said here, let's not let language be a barrier. There are certainly some words that are better avoided, words like handicapped, or even talking about the disabled as a group of people. There are better ways of talking, like people living with disability or mental illness, etc. But don't let those things stop us from engaging either, out of fear of offending or saying the wrong thing. Most people, just one thing there, most people who live with disability, or many people who live with disability, they've already been around the prayer for healing rodeo so many times that they're not necessarily looking for you to offer to pray for their healing. As well intended as that might be, and who knows that God maybe not heal them one day. But our own experience echoes that I've heard from others, which is that very early after we had prayed and prayed and prayed for Beth to be healed, God said very clearly to Lou, and I feel the same. He said, "No, I'm not going to heal Bethany. She is who she is." What that means for her in the new creation, we don't know. But we look forward to finding out. 4, though, find a friendship rhythm. It can be challenging, particularly with people like Beth who don't act and interact in the same way as others. Friendship might look different. It might ask us to go at a slower pace. It can mean presence and proximity rather than pure conversation. Remember Lorraine and the mums who know that the only people who hang out with their kids are paid to do so. Thank you for all who make an effort in that space, even when it's not always easy. And finally, there's much more that could be said in this space. Advocacy and self-representation. This means us as a church, and particularly church leadership, listening, learning, and allowing people with mental illness and who live with disability to self-represent and to be part of us learning and finding answers. And in that regard, I'm very pleased to say that, and very grateful actually, that Nancy Blanche, who read our passage earlier, has very kindly agreed to serve as an advocate for inclusion and beyond, inclusion and love here at New Vine, to help us hear the voices of those that we need to hear as we think this through. Nancy has a passion for inclusion and a combination of personal experience and experience caring for others who live with chronic health conditions, disabilities, trauma, mental health challenges, and neurodivergence. So Nancy, thank you. Nancy's going to help me and the staff and the lead team think through how we continue this journey of not only including but loving people experiencing these things. Maybe you can help too. Perhaps we could set up a working group or something like that. Make yourself known to us if you'd like to be part of us becoming a community known for love. I'm going to finish there as we finish together with a song.